Alright, so this happened when I was still living in my old place. A small apartment in a pretty quiet neighborhood. My roommates were both out of town for the weekend, visiting their families, so I had the whole apartment to myself. I was actually looking forward to it. A chance to have some alone time, watch movies, eat junk food, and just relax without having to worry about anyone else. Friday night, I ordered some takeout, got into my comfy clothes, and settled in for a movie marathon. The apartment was eerily quiet without my roommates around, but I kind of liked it. It felt like I had the entire place to myself, which was rare. After finishing up a couple of movies, I decided to call it a night. I double-checked the locks on the front door and the windows, then headed to bed. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard this faint noise. It was like a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe some noise from outside. But it kept going, this rhythmic tapping that was just loud enough to get under my skin. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what it was. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping out of my room and into the hallway. The tapping stopped as soon as I stepped into the living room. I looked around, my heart racing, but everything seemed normal. The windows were closed, the front door was locked, and there was no one there. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or something. Old buildings make weird noises sometimes, right? I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. It was like I was being watched, like there was someone else in the apartment with me. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for any other sounds, but everything was quiet again. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was hearing things because I was alone in the apartment. I spent most of the day out, running errands and trying to keep myself busy. By the time I got back, it was already getting dark. As soon as I walked into the apartment, I felt that same weird vibe again. It was like the air was thicker, heavier somehow. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. I went through my usual routine, made dinner, watched some TV, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye. Around 11 p.m., I decided to go to bed. I made sure everything was locked up tight, just like the night before, and got into bed. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like it was coming from right outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't like any noise I'd heard before. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone was tapping their fingers against the wall or the door. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to hear it better. The tapping continued, steady and slow, like it was counting down to something. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the door. The light cast weird shadows on the walls, and I half expected to see the door start to move, but it didn't. I took a deep breath and got out of bed, my hands shaking. I had to know what was making that noise. I walked over to the door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the hallway. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened the door, and the hallway was empty. I opened the door wider and stepped into the hallway, shining the flashlight around. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything that could have been making the noise. I checked the living room, the kitchen, even the bathroom, but everything was exactly how I'd left it. The front door was still locked, and all the windows were closed. I went back to my room, my mind racing. I didn't understand what was happening. I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little noise set me on edge. I lay there for hours, listening, waiting for something to happen, but the tapping didn't come back that night. The next day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept much, and I felt like I was on edge the entire day. I kept hearing little noises, every creak and groan of the apartment making me jump. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I decided to stay up late, just to see if the tapping would come back. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching TV, trying to act like everything was normal. But around midnight, I heard it again. The tapping, faint at first, but growing louder. This time, it was coming from the kitchen. I turned off the TV and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was slow and steady, like someone was tapping their fingernails against the kitchen counter. I got up, my hands shaking, and walked to the kitchen. The tapping stopped as soon as I walked in, and everything was silent. I turned on the light, half expecting to see something, but the kitchen was empty. No one was there. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Was I going crazy? Was I just hearing things? I walked around the kitchen, checking the windows and the back door, but everything was locked up tight. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it, listening for the tapping to start again. But it didn't. The apartment was dead silent, and that was almost worse than the noise itself. Eventually, I went back to my room and got into bed. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the sound of the tapping again. This time, it was right outside my bedroom door. I sat up, my heart racing. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone was tapping their nails against the door itself. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the door. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, staring at the door, listening to the tapping. It went on for what felt like forever, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The apartment was silent again. I sat there, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the door, too scared to move. When morning finally came, I got up, packed a bag, and left the apartment. I couldn't stay there alone anymore. I called a friend and asked if I could crash at their place for the rest of the weekend. I didn't tell them what was going on, just that I needed to get out of the apartment for a bit. I stayed with my friend until my roommates came back. I never told them about the tapping. I didn't want them to think I was crazy or that there was something wrong with the apartment, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was in there with me that weekend. I still live in that apartment, but I'm never comfortable being there alone anymore. Every time I'm by myself, I listen for that tapping sound, waiting for it to start again. It hasn't happened since, but the memory of it is enough to make my skin crawl. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think I hear it faintly in the distance, like a reminder that I'm never really alone. It was one of those quiet weekends where nothing much was going on. My parents were out of town, visiting some relatives in another state, and my little sister was on a school camping trip. So I had the house to myself, which was something I usually looked forward to. You know, having the freedom to blast music as loud as I wanted, eat junk food without anyone nagging me about it, and just lounge around without a care in the world. That's how I thought it would go, anyway. The day started off pretty normal. I spent most of it just bumming around, playing video games, and catching up on a couple of shows I'd been meaning to watch. Around the afternoon, I decided to order some takeout, because cooking for one just felt like a waste of time. The delivery guy showed up, and I grabbed the food, tipped him, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, eating my food and scrolling through my phone, feeling totally at ease. The house was quiet, which I liked. Usually it was filled with the sounds of my sister arguing with my parents, or the TV blaring in the background, but right then, it was peaceful. After I finished eating, I cleaned up and went back to my room. The rest of the evening went by without much happening. I played some more games, texted a few friends, and just hung out. It wasn't until around 9 p.m. that things started to get a little weird. I was in my room, just laying on my bed with my laptop, when I thought I heard a noise from downstairs. It wasn't loud, just a faint creaking sound, like the floorboards shifting under someone's weight. I paused for a second, listening, but then everything was quiet again. I brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe the wind pushing against the windows. Our house was old, and it made weird noises all the time. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was a bit louder, and it sounded more like a shuffle, like someone was moving around down there. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, trying to listen more closely. But there was nothing, just silence. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but you know how your mind works when you're alone. It starts coming up with all these scenarios about what it could be. I thought about going downstairs to check it out, but then again, I didn't want to freak myself out over nothing. So I stayed put, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then maybe 15 minutes later, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't just a shuffle. It was a distinct, heavy thud, like something being dropped on the floor. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't just sit there and ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight feature, not because I thought I'd need it, but because it made me feel a little safer. Slowly, I crept out of my room and into the hallway. The house was dark, except for the glow from my room, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears as I made my way toward the stairs. I stood at the top of the staircase, holding my breath, listening for any sound. Everything was quiet again, which only made me more nervous. I couldn't hear anything, no movement, no creaking, just silence. I took a deep breath and started making my way down the stairs, one slow step at a time. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I winced at every sound, trying to move as quietly as possible. When I reached the bottom, I paused again, shining my phone's light around the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was all where it should be. The windows were closed, and the front door was still locked. I felt a little silly for getting so worked up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked around the first floor, checking the kitchen, the dining room, even the laundry room. Everything looked normal. I was about to head back upstairs when I remembered the back door. I hadn't checked it since I came downstairs, and a small part of me was worried that maybe I hadn't locked it after grabbing the takeout earlier. I walked over to the back door, my hand trembling a bit as I reached for the lock. It was locked, just like I'd left it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling a bit stupid for getting so freaked out over nothing. I turned to go back to the living room when I heard it again. A creak, this time right behind me. I spun around, shining my light toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway leading to the back door. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door to the basement was open, just a crack. Now, our basement door is usually kept closed and locked. My parents are pretty strict about that because the basement is old and kind of dangerous. There's a bunch of stuff down there that hasn't been touched in years, and the floor is uneven. So, seeing that door open, even just a bit, sent a wave of panic through me. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Had I opened it earlier and forgotten to close it? Was it possible it had just come open on its own? I didn't think so. That door was heavy, and it always took a good push to get it open. My first instinct was to slam it shut and lock it, but something stopped me. I needed to know if there was someone down there. I needed to know if I was just being paranoid, or if there really was something going on. So, against every bit of common sense I had, I walked over to the door and pulled it open. The basement stairs stretched out before me, disappearing into darkness. I shone my phone's flashlight down the steps, but the light barely made a dent in the shadows. I couldn't see the bottom, and I sure as hell wasn't about to go down there. I stood at the top of the stairs, trying to hear anything that would tell me if someone was down there. At first there was nothing, just the eerie silence of an empty house. But then, faintly, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like something moving around in the dark. My heart was in my throat, and every instinct was screaming at me to shut the door and get out of the house. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring down into that darkness, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Then suddenly, I heard a soft thud, like something being dropped onto the concrete floor. That was enough for me. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What the hell was down there? I ran back upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice steady. As I told them I thought there was someone in my house, they told me to stay in my room and that they would send someone over right away. I sat on my bed, clutching my phone, my eyes glued to the door. I could still hear the faint sounds from downstairs, but I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination or if there really was someone moving around down there. It felt like hours before I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived and searched the entire house. They checked every room, every closet, and even the attic. When they finally made their way to the basement, I stood at the top of the stairs, holding my breath as they went down. They were down there for a long time, but eventually they came back up, telling me they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house besides me. They tried to reassure me that everything was fine, that maybe I'd just heard some noises and gotten scared. But I knew what I heard. There was something down there. After the police left, I stayed with a friend for the rest of the weekend. I couldn't bring myself to stay in that house alone. When my parents got back, I told them what happened, but they just brushed it off as me being jumpy or maybe having a bad dream. But I know what I heard. And even now, I still get chills thinking about that open basement door and the sounds coming from the darkness below. I never found out what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. But every time I'm home alone now, I can't help but listen for those creaks and thuds, hoping I never hear them again. It happened on a Friday night when I was home alone. My roommates were all out for the weekend, so I thought I'd have the place to myself, just some peace and quiet. I had it all planned out. Order some takeout, maybe watch a movie or two, and just relax. It's not often that I get the whole apartment to myself, so I was actually looking forward to it. The first few hours were pretty chill. I ordered Chinese food, binge-watched some Netflix, and even had a glass of wine. Everything was going smoothly, and I was enjoying the alone time. But then, around 11 p.m., things started to get weird. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard this faint noise. At first I thought it was just the neighbors, but then I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. It was this soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was gently knocking on the wall. I paused the show I was watching and listened for a minute, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway near my bedroom. It wasn't loud, just this consistent tapping that almost sounded like it was coming from the walls. I got up and walked over to the hallway, but as soon as I got closer, the tapping stopped. Just dead silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the pipes or something. The building was old, and it made weird noises all the time, so I tried not to let it bother me. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't really focus on my show anymore. I kept glancing toward the hallway, waiting to hear the noise again. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more insistent, like someone was actually knocking on a door. I froze, my heart starting to race. It was definitely coming from the hallway, and it sounded like it was coming from inside one of the closets. Now here's the thing. We have this small storage closet in the hallway that we never use. It's always locked, and none of us have ever bothered to open it because it's just full of junk from the previous tenants. I don't even know if we have a key for it. I walked over to the hallway again, this time feeling a bit more uneasy. The tapping was still going, steady and rhythmic, like someone was trapped inside and trying to get out. I stood in front of the closet door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a second, I thought about just opening it, but then I realized I didn't even have the key. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen, but as soon as I did, the tapping stopped. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I mean, it's not like I could just ignore it, but at the same time, I wasn't about to start breaking into locked closets in the middle of the night. I went back to the living room, trying to act like everything was fine, but I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. It was like the air in the apartment had changed, become heavier somehow. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm myself. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the building making noises. But deep down, I knew something was off. I could feel it in my gut, that instinctive sense that something isn't right. About an hour later, I heard another noise, but this time it wasn't tapping. It was more like a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the kitchen. I jumped up from the couch, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making my way to the kitchen. As I got closer, the sound stopped. I shone the light around the kitchen, but everything looked normal. The chairs were pushed in, the counters were clean, nothing was out of place. I walked around the kitchen, checking everything, but there was nothing there. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing. I felt like I was going crazy, hearing all these noises but not finding anything. I went back to the living room, but I didn't sit down this time. I just stood there, listening. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the living room window. I turned around, shining the flashlight toward the window. The blinds were drawn, so I couldn't see outside, but I could hear the tapping clear as day, like someone was standing on the other side, knocking on the glass. I took a step back, my heart in my throat. We lived on the third floor, so there was no way someone could be outside the window. I slowly walked toward the window, my hand shaking as I reached up to pull the blinds aside. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with all sorts of horrible possibilities, but then I yanked the blinds up. There was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outline of the street below. I stood there, staring out the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. I didn't know if I was relieved or more freaked out by the fact that there was nothing there. I let the blinds fall back into place and backed away from the window, my mind spinning. I went back to the hallway, feeling like I needed to check the closet again. I walked over to it, standing in front of the door, listening. The tapping had stopped, but I could feel this cold draft coming from underneath the door, like there was something on the other side. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore it, but I also couldn't bring myself to open the door. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the door, until finally I turned around and walked back to the living room. I sat down on the couch, pulling the blanket around me like it could somehow protect me from whatever was in the apartment. I sat there for hours, just listening. The apartment was dead silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every little creak and groan of the building set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting the closet door to fly open or something to come out. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking up to my phone ringing. It was my roommate calling to check in, and I almost cried with relief when I heard their voice. I didn't tell them what had happened. I didn't want them to think I was losing it, but just hearing another person made me feel a little better. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about the noises. I kept going over it in my head, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The apartment felt different now, like it wasn't really mine anymore, like something had invaded my space. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to just sleep through whatever was happening. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, listening. For a while, everything was quiet, and I started to think maybe it was over. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't tapping or scraping. It was a low, guttural whisper, like someone was speaking right next to my ear. I froze, my body going cold. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was this deep, raspy voice, and it was so close I could feel the breath on my skin. I turned on the light and looked around, but of course there was nothing there. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to move, too scared to stay where I was. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, practically begging them to come over. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy, I just needed someone there with me. They showed up about half an hour later, and I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I didn't tell them everything, just that I was hearing weird noises and needed company. We stayed up the rest of the night, watching TV and trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that filled the apartment. I kept glancing toward the hallway, expecting to hear the tapping or see the closet door open, but nothing happened. It was like whatever it was knew I wasn't alone anymore and had decided to back off. The next day, I left the apartment and stayed with my friend for the rest of the weekend. I couldn't bring myself to go back until my roommates came home. When they did, I told them about the noises, but they just laughed it off, saying it was probably just the building settling or something. I never figured out what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. Even now, whenever I'm alone in that apartment, I can't help but listen for the tapping, the scraping, the whispering. I still get chills thinking about it, and I always make sure to avoid that hallway closet whenever I can. It's been a while since that night, and nothing like that has happened since. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I still feel that cold draft coming from under the closet door, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, something is still in there, waiting.